Lady Geist is my favorite hero in Deadlock. Although in popularity, she may be overshadowed by other heroes like Vindicta, she's still really fun to play. But a lot of people struggle to get effectiveness out of the character. She's pretty straightforward on a surface level, but she actually has a lot of nuance to her kit, which makes her difficult to pick up and actually perform on. For players that are actually interested in picking up Lady Geist or just learning how to master her, in this guide we're going to cover 3 major topics. The first is a broad playstyle overview, which will cover her general playstyle, her strengths, weaknesses, and counters. Second is her skills. Which skills are important, which skills you should max first, and what are the niche uses for each skill, or niche things that you haven't actually known about with the skill to help you improve your game. And the last is covering her items. What items are actually good? What stats do you actually want to prioritize? And what flexibility options do you have that you can purchase from game to game in specific scenarios? So first, let's get started on her playstyle overview. There are a couple key things to note about her playstyle. First is that she uses a revolver for her primary weapon. This means that she has a flick-heavy aim style, much like the Wingman from Apex, or Cassidy from Overwatch, or the Sheriff or Deagle from Counter-Strike and Valorant. This resonates much more with people that don't enjoy track aiming. The second thing is that she's a really strong duelist. So for those who want to take 1v1s and actually be able to split push in the side lanes and not lose any fights, Lady Geist is really effective. Mostly due to her ultimate that lets her swap targets HP, so that even if she gets low, she can just essentially nuke their whole health bar and heal up to full. The third thing about her playstyle is that she's really farm reliant and she needs a lot of souls to become actually scary. So she takes some time to scale. Some of her strengths are that she is great in small skirmishes and 1v1 fights, like I talked about earlier. She's a strong duelist, so it makes sense that she's actually good in small fights. She also has incredible healing potential. Her ultimate and her life drain give her a ton of lifesteal and sustain throughout fights. She also has a really long duration silence. This is really nice in 1v1s, but also fights. There's characters like Yamato or other diving heroes that really want to go in and then pop a defensive ability when they get low, or just use a mobility skill to get out. Because of Lady Geist's silence though, if they get tagged by that once they dive in, they have no ability to get out or survive. Some of her weaknesses are low mobility and reliance on souls. Lady Geist has absolutely no mobility skills. If you couple that with her already low base stats with very limited sprint speed and movement speed, she's very susceptible to range and getting kited. She's also heavily reliant on souls, which she needs to level up her abilities because a lot of her max level perks for her abilities are really strong, and she only really picks up after she gets them. She also needs a lot of items because she needs a lot of different stats to help offset her costs to her abilities. Her counters are range and crowd control. Lady Geist has no ability, so she is really susceptible to things that have long range or can threaten her out of her effective range of her abilities. Crowd control is also really scary for Lady Geist because a lot of her healing and burst heal that she does with her ultimate or her life drain, she really needs to be able to get those off. And if you can crowd control her before she's able to cast those abilities, a lot of times you can just burst her down before she even gets to heal back up. Really rough matchups are Vindicta. Vindicta has all of the things that counter Lady Geist. Vindicta can just stay in the air and has a lot of range, and she can use her stake to crowd control Lady Geist so that she can't even move out while she's being bursted down. The flight is really annoying too for Lady Geist because now you can't actually land your essence bomb very easily at all, because normally you need the person to be on the ground or a surface so that your essence bomb explosion is easy to land because you can just stick it to a wall or the ground. But with Vindicta flying in the air, it's really difficult. It's basically down an ability, and she's out of range for your ultimate and your life drain. Now for the skill overview. First ability is Essence Bomb. Lady Geist sacrifices some health to lob a bomb that sticks to the first surface it comes in contact with, or hero, and then it detonates to do damage after a short duration. This ability is kind of Lady Geist's bread and butter in the early game. It's her poke and it's her farming ability, because when she levels up to max perk, it gets a really nice damage over time after the explosion that helps with farming neutral camps or even just the wave. The first upgrade for Essence Bomb is increasing the size of the explosion. This increases the radius of the explosion by a pretty decent amount, and it helps you land it and also be able to farm late waves because sometimes the troopers just spread out a little bit too much. The second perk increases the damage dealt. This is nice because it doesn't increase the damage done to you, but increases the damage dealt, so you get much more efficiency with each cast of this ability. The last perk is what I talked about a little bit earlier. After the explosion, it leaves behind a puddle, which does damage after time. This damage after time does a percentage of the original explosion's damage over the course of about 4 seconds. Most games, Essence Bomb is the ability that you will upgrade to completion first, mostly just because it helps with your farming souls so much. It increases your ability to kill neutral camps, and increases your ability to farm waves exponentially faster than if you didn't max it. Because of that reason, it just accelerates your game plan of farming souls, which allows you to upgrade your other abilities much faster. Lady Geist's second ability is her Life Drain. Lady Geist tethers to a target, dealing damage over time to the target and healing you for the same amount. This ability is often seen as Lady Geist's signature ability from all of her basic abilities. A lot of players rate this ability very highly because at its max perk, it gets a silence. Now, the first upgrade to this ability is the increase in damage. The second upgrade to this ability is increase in duration. This couples really nice with the increase of damage as well to multiply your damage even further. And then the last upgrade to this ability is an insanely powerful one, which allows you to silence the enemy during the whole entire duration of the tether. A lot of people view this as Geist's best ability and most iconic, and a lot of early guides were suggesting to max this ability first, because the silence is incredibly powerful in duels and 1v1s. Now, I do think the silence is an incredibly powerful ability, but I don't think it's really straightforward on whether you should max this ability first or even second. Oftentimes, I max Life Drain third after Malice. That's because even though the silence is really useful, you really want to max Essence Drain at least first or second, just to help with your farming. And then after that, if you max Life Drain, you'll get really good dueling potential, but then you'll have to rely on your weapon damage throughout the mid to late game. If you max Malice second, then you have a lot more control over the battlefield. But honestly, this isn't cut in stone. It really just depends on the composition that you're playing against. If you're playing against the Yamato, then having your drain max pretty early is really important because oftentimes when the Yamato runs in, you can soul exchange her and then you can immediately go into silence, which will completely screw over the Yamato player because they won't be able to ult to save themselves. Lady Geist's third ability is her Malice. Lady Geist sacrifices her health to throw some blood shards that deal damage equal to the sacrificed health. Upon hitting an enemy with Malice, it applies a stacking slow and a debuff that increases all damage from Lady Geist to the target. Now, the first upgrade to this ability is a decrease in its cooldown. The second one allows you to increase the damage done, but it also increases the damage that you receive from blood shards as well. And finally, the last one increases the AoE significantly, allowing you to hit a really wide range of area with the Malice. Coupled with the fact that Malice has an infinite range until it hits a wall, it basically makes this ability impossible to miss. Malice is definitely Lady Geist's most underrated ability, but recently people have come to understand how broken this ability actually is. Malice has a really short cooldown and a high health cost, so it's pretty difficult to use consistently early game without putting yourself in danger. But late game, it ends up being an ability that is your most powerful and useful. It just provides so much AoE CC and slow that if the enemy team doesn't play fast in their fights and wants to play a little bit slower, the stacking slow and damage amplification will just completely destroy them. So it puts the enemy team in a rough spot where they have to take decisive and fast fights against Lady Geist, otherwise they'll just get whittled down. In a lot of games, I like to max Malice second, just because I think it offers Lady Geist way more utility, and she becomes much more useful to their team in team fights with this ability. Lady Geist has a lot of mobility issues, and being able to spam in a really easy AoE slow makes it much easier for you to just walk down your opponents, rather than having to spend a fortune and getting so much mobility that you can actually chase them. Lady Geist's ultimate ability is her Soul Exchange. It's a really simple ability. Lady Geist just swaps her health percentages with a target. The first upgrade for this ability reduces its cooldown pretty significantly, about 30 seconds. The second upgrade lowers the minimum health threshold the enemy gets left at. And the final upgrade gives you a buff that gives you a large fire rate and spirit resist buff for 8 seconds after casting your ultimate. This ability is what makes you so scary in 1v1s. Even if the enemy is significantly stronger than you and you're behind, Soul Exchange just swings the fight so strongly in your favor that it makes Lady Geist extremely difficult to 1v1 even when she's behind. Now, although this ability is really powerful, it has an incredibly short range, so that's why you'll see a lot of Lady Geist players buy a lot of ability range increase, just so that your threat range is a lot bigger. You should always max this ability last, just because all of your other abilities are so important and you can use them so much more consistently that you really shouldn't be wasting your upgrades on Soul Exchange, which only comes every couple of minutes. Now that we've gone over what Lady Geist's abilities do, it's time to get into items. Item builds are very complex and diverse in Deadlock. Although recently, I think players have finally started to find out the power of actives and are just spamming really good active items on characters. But there's still 16 item slots, and knowing what to build is really important. If you're starting Deadlock, then this part of learning a new character is very overwhelming. For items, I think it's really important to understand what a hero lacks and what stats they really need. Not only does this help you when learning to build new heroes, it also gives you the ability to adapt your item build to deal with each unique team that you go up against. So with that being said, what does Lady Geist even need? Well, I think we should break this into 3 main categories. We'll talk about highest priority stats. These are stats that give us a huge benefit early into the game, as well as allow our hero to function in lane and contribute to our team. The second is important stats. These are stats that a Lady Geist eventually needs, but they're not as effective unless you already have invested a bit into your high priority stats. The third are nice to haves. These are stats Lady Geist really enjoys once she gets her core stats. If you see these stats on items that give you a lot of your core stats, then you feel really happy about getting them. The fourth section is luxury stats. These are stats that Lady Geist actually does enjoy to have, but you really don't want to go out of your way for. They don't really make or break your decision to get the item, but you're happy to see them. So let's get started off in highest priority. The first stat that I think is in highest priority is weapon damage. Although I don't think Lady Geist relies on weapon damage later in the game, I think weapon damage is really important for Lady Geist in the early game. Lady Geist relies on her gun for early and mid game a lot because her self damage is pretty high, and she needs to have enough resistances and lifesteal before she can really rely on her spells. Think of Lady Geist as an 80-20 to weapon damage spirit damage in the early game, and later into the game she can shift downwards to 70-30 or even 60-40. The second stat is resistances. Lady Geist damages herself with 2 of her main abilities. Spirit resistance not only makes her tankier so she can brawl and actually survive in close range fights to use her abilities, but it also allows her to spam her abilities more without actually damaging herself too heavily. Lady Geist also has one of the highest base healths in the game, and between Soul Exchange and Life Drain, she has a lot of health to leverage. Resistances help you multiply the effectiveness of all that health you're gaining through your skills. Good players will also try to burst down a Lady Geist during CC, so having resist makes it a lot harder for you to die before you can get your spells off. The last thought I want to talk about here is regeneration. Lady Geist has one of the lowest base health regenerations in the game, but she also has skills that cost health. Although we may use our life draining abilities sparingly in the early game, we still crave regeneration to not only deal with strong poke heroes, but also give us a cheap way to offset our self damage until we get enough damage to make lifesteal actually worth it. Now on to important stats. The first one I want to talk about is mobility. Lady Geist has the lowest base movement speed in the game, coupled with low range on her most crucial survivability tools and absolutely zero mobility skills. Although Lady Geist is an incredibly strong duelist, we still need to be able to pick our fights and not just get kited to death. Adding a little bit of mobility allows us to not be immediately caught if we're trying to pressure side lanes, as well as not get left in the dust if we're actually trying to help with skirmishes and fights in the early and mid game. Next that I want to talk about is lifesteal. As the game goes on, we need to constantly use our essence bomb to farm and use our malice to constantly fish for picks or create pressure during the standoffs and fights. Those health costs add up a lot, and lifesteal allows us to stay healthy while using our most impactful abilities. We also get insane value out of lifesteal because we're also investing a lot into resistances. For any heroes that rely on long cooldowns and burst damage, if they can't kill us within that short burst window, then we'll be able to heal right back up to full. Third stat is health. We want to be tanky enough on Lady Geist to act as a pseudo frontline, and health works really well with resistances to increase our overall tankiness. So we can't just get bursted down. And it also synergizes really well with Soul Exchange, since it essentially multiplies our health by 2x. And the last stat I want to talk about here is crowd control. I think a little bit of crowd control goes a long way on Lady Geist. We do have a stacking slow on our malice that allows us to eventually chase down targets, but sometimes we need an immediate burst of CC to make plays on our own, or just to deal with one of the many heroes that can only really be stopped by hard CC, like Seven and Haze ultimates. Alright, now on to nice to have stats. The first one here is ammo. Lady Geist is a damage dealer, and as the game goes on, your damage goes up significantly, and the amount of damage you lose during your reload animation is pretty significant. Having a big enough magazine to keep pumping out damage and lifestealing is nice without having to reload constantly. The next thing to talk about here is ability duration. Pretty much all of your abilities benefit from ability duration. Even your ultimate does after you unlock the last upgrade. So I like having ability duration in my build, but I just don't like to go out of my way early to get it. The next thing I want to talk about is ability range. Now, ability range does feel awesome for all of Lady Geist's abilities. The area size increase to Essence Bomb makes farming trivial, and the giant puddle left over acts as area denial when you add in other damage riders like maybe Mystic Slow. Life Drain also becomes incredibly long range and becomes very frightening once it begins its silence. You also no longer have to be on top of people to use your soul exchange, so it becomes much harder to deny you those life swaps. The last thing I want to talk about here is cooldown reduction. Lady Geist doesn't really need much cooldown reduction in her kit. Malice is your most important ability to spam, and it's already on a very low cooldown. Essence Bomb is also on a fairly low cooldown at 10 seconds, and is already low enough to always be up when you need to farm a camp or a wave. Cooldown reduction is pretty nice. I do like to have the lowest tier 1250 cooldown reduction item, but I generally don't upgrade it to full until very late in the game if I just have some extra money left over. All right, the last section I want to talk about for stats is luxury stats. The first one here is fire rate, and fire rate is definitely nice to have, but I generally don't like to focus too heavily on weapon damage late into the game, and that's where I think fire rate really shines. So because of that, fire rate is only to increase our damage and doesn't give us any special benefit. So although I think it's useful for weapon damage increase, I just don't think it's as important as other heroes. The second thing here is shields. Shields do make you a lot tankier and help you from getting bursted down. But as Lady Geist, we prefer health over shields since we have a lot of healing and lifesteal. And those just don't get as much value with shields as they do with health. The last thing here is spirit power. This is personally my stat to pick as a noob trap for Lady Geist. I think Lady Geist's spirit power ratios are pretty decent, but they also increase the damage her abilities do to her as well. This means you don't really want to invest into spirit power too early because it makes you do way too much damage to yourself. And you don't have enough spirit resistance or lifesteal early on to offset that. You end up not being able to really take any fights and take way too long to come online if you invest only into spirit power early game. That's fine and actually really strong in particular matchups in games where it's a lot slower and you actually get time to scale up without taking fights. But it leaves you in a weak state early game if you really need to contest and fight people early on. You'll actually also find out that damage riders like improved burst and escalating exposure give you much more damage than buying raw spirit power with things like Boundless Spirit. Late game, I do think spirit damage in general becomes much more important for Lady Geist to focus on over than weapon damage. That's just because Malice and Essence Bomb let you do way more in team fights with way less effort. Trying to shoot the right target in the team fight as Lady Geist, where you have really low mobility and ways to actually get to your target, is really rough. Whereas your abilities like Essence Bomb and Malice have huge AoEs and really long ranges, so you can consistently do damage and actually be a threat, and also apply your lifesteal to everybody. With all these stats in mind, we can actually look at items and see which certain items give Lady Geist crazy value. Let's try to start with 500 soul items. 500 soul items are generally really nice for most heroes, but there are a few that I think find particularly synergy on Lady Geist and she really enjoys to have them. And those items are Restorative Shot, Mystic Burst, Enduring Spirit, Sprint Boots, and Extra Regen / Healing Ray. Restorative Shot I think is really nice on Lady Geist just because it gives you everything early that you really need. It gives you a little bit of weapon damage, and it gives you sustain so that you can spam your abilities a little bit more, as well as giving you resistances to make you a little bit more tanky and you can play as more of a bruiser. The second item I want to talk about is Mystic Burst, and I think Mystic Burst is, honestly, it's great on so many characters. On Lady Geist, I think it's particularly good just because your cooldowns line up so well with Mystic Burst. And late game, you can just trigger this over and over and over again, where Mystic Burst, I just feel like gives you so much damage and value over the course of the game. I find it hard to not take this item, and Improved Burst is also a really crazy upgrade to this item as well for Lady Geist. The third thing here is Enduring Spirit. I really didn't like Enduring Spirit early on, but ever since its buffs to its stats, making it more in line with other items, I actually think it's a pretty nice item to buy with Lady Geist. I don't buy it super early into the laning phase, but I almost always like to have it in my inventory going out of the laning phase, just because it provides crazy good value for 500 souls. It's the cheapest form of spirit lifesteal, and Lady Geist just frankly loves that stat. The fourth thing here is Sprint Boots. I think Sprint Boots are pretty much mandatory on Lady Geist. Lady Geist has the lowest movement speed in the game. If you couple that with having no mobility skills as well, Lady Geist just needs to be able to get around the map. And Sprint Boots gives you that little nudge in mobility while also giving you health regen and weapon damage, which are really nice to have in the early game. And the last two items I want to talk about are Extra Regen and Healing Ray. I almost never buy these items together, and they both serve the similar purpose, which is just early game regeneration and ability to survive through the laning phase. Now, they both have slightly different niches. Extra Regen is a lot better at dealing with constant chip damage, whereas Healing Ray is better at dealing with large amounts of damage that are more infrequent. So realistically, just pick whichever one that you think fits the matchup a lot better, or if you're lazy like me, just take Extra Regen every time and sell it later. Now, on to 1250 items. Now, this is the item tier that I think Lady Geist has the most amount of items that are just really good on her for, which is why I really like this tier, because it allows you to spike early and then save up for 6k items. But I do think there are a few items that are especially good on her, and so let's cover those real quick. There's Spirit Armor, Berserker, Bullet Resist Shredder, Mystic Shot, and Soul Shredder. And the first item should come as no surprise. I think Spirit Armor is just so good on Lady Geist. She constantly does spirit damage to herself, and she's also really afraid of burst damage, and most burst damage comes in the form of spirit damage as well. And so 1250 for 20% spirit resist is just such a good rate that it's hard to pass up this item at all, and you generally just want to get this pretty early after the laning phase. The second item is Berserker. I've seen quite a few people skip this item, and I don't quite know why. Even in spirit damage focused builds, I think Berserker is just a must have. I think a lot of heroes in Deadlock benefit from having a decent amount of weapon damage and spirit damage. And even though my Lady Geist builds tend to be more towards spirit damage in the mid to late game, I really like having Berserker in the early to mid game because it just gives you so much weapon damage for so much value. Even though our first expensive items tend to be towards spirit power, Berserker allows us to get so much weapon damage for so cheap. And she synergizes so well with Berserker with being able to stack it without actually having to take damage from other people. She can just spam her abilities, do damage to herself while life stealing up and get full stacks of Berserker and have it at full stacks constantly. On top of that, it adds a little bit of resistances too, with giving us a decent chunk of bullet resist, which allows us to be tankier in the early game. And the flat ammo increase is actually really nice. Most things give percent ammo increases, but Berserker gives flat ammo increase. And for a hero that has a low amount of base ammo, getting flat ammo is such a huge boost to us. It allows us to keep doing DPS without having to reload constantly. The third thing here is Bullet Resist Shredder. Bullet Resist Shredder I think also has crazy value on Lady Geist. Again, it has resistances, which allows us to be a little bit tankier and work more towards a bruiser archetype, as well as giving us weapon damage for doing spirit damage. Lady Geist is really easy to apply spirit damage to everybody. Essence Bomb has a pretty large AoE. Malice has a super short cooldown to constantly reapply Bullet Resist Shredder, on top of getting damage amplification, which combos with the Bullet Resist Shredder a lot as well. And so you just get to have a really nice, efficient trio of stats that increase your damage by a decent amount while also giving you a little bit of tankiness for pretty cheap. I think these three 1250 items are the items that I'm most excited to buy when I'm playing Lady Geist. I think Soul Shredder and Mystic Shot are also really nice, but I think these top three are probably the most impactful. Soul Shredder, I think, benefits Lady Geist a lot. She isn't the best user of it compared to someone like Infernus, but the cheap amount of lifesteal when she does trigger it is so impactful, while you also factor in the fact that it gives a decent amount of weapon damage as well. You'll notice that a lot of 1250 items here are weapon damage items, and the reason for that is on Lady Geist, she wants to have weapon damage for the early and mid game, but you don't want to have to spend too many souls on those items. The 1250 items for Lady Geist are all incredibly useful while providing you a decent amount of weapon damage. This allows you to have a good early game spike to transition into more spirit damage items and vitality items that are actually good for your character. Now onto 3k soul items. The first here on the list should be pretty familiar to the previous one, which is improved spirit armor. Just like spirit armor, improved spirit armor just offers you such a large increase in survivability while also reducing the damage you do to yourself. It's really hard to pass up on this. The second item I want to talk about is Warpstone. Now, I've seen a lot of Lady Geist builds that either really like this item or don't buy it at all. I do think Warpstone is not mandatory, but it is really hard to pass up on. It just gives you a nice increase in weapon damage while also giving you mobility and survivability because it gives you bullet resist after you teleport. It just makes it really hard to not pick up Warpstone. I think I tend to pick up Warpstone way more often than I don't get it. But in the situations that I don't go for Warpstone, I think there are a few situations where you don't need to go Warpstone if the enemy team just doesn't have the ability to kite you, or you just don't need to run away from them. Third item here I want to talk about is Mystic Slow. This is an item I'm surprised more people are not building on Lady Geist. Now, Lady Geist already has a slow in her kit, but that actually works in Mystic Slow's favor by a lot. The slows from her Malice and Mystic Slow stack. And so if you land one Malice, it slows them significantly, even if they just only have one stack on them. And the reason why this is important is because it makes it much easier to start landing subsequent stacks of Malice. And once you get to 2 or 3 stacks, they're basically rooted and they can't move unless they use mobility skills. It's really impactful, and this the difference between having Mystic Slow and not having Mystic Slow is essentially having an extra stack or 2 stacks of your Malice. On top of that, the On top of that, the improved and increased attack speed slow is also really nice because when people jump on you, you can just use Essence Bomb on your feet. And even if you get CC'd after that, the damage over time effect just constantly reapplies Mystic Slow. And everyone's just getting AoE slowed and AoE attack speed slowed, which increases your survivability because people are just shooting you for way less and way faster. And so you have a way higher chance to actually survive the burst damage and just heal back up to full. I also really like this while poking because now your AoE Malice, that's really easy to hit. Now also AoE attack speed slows everybody as well. It's just overall a really strong item and it's super cheap. And I think it makes a huge difference, especially when you upgraded Malice to max. The last one here is Improved Burst. And honestly, I don't think this needs much of an explanation. Improved Burst is really good on most heroes. It's incredibly good on Lady Geist. There's just so many ways for Lady Geist just pumps out spirit damage. Although it might not be a lot all at once, she just constantly is able to easily hit multiple targets with spirit damage consistently on a low cooldown from a super long range. Malice has an incredibly long range and incredibly wide AoE, and Essence Bomb you can lob from incredibly long range as well, and it has a large AoE that leaves behind a puddle as well. And so if people take enough damage, it now all of a sudden procs Improved Burst, which does a percent of their max HP, and you're just doing that constantly to everybody. Now the last item tier is 6k souls. I think Lady Geist has a ton of 6k items that work well on her, but the one item that I think has by far the most impact is Leech. Leech just gives you so much. It gives you HP, it gives you weapon damage, it gives you spirit damage, and it also gives you spirit and bullet lifesteal. Now, I think Spirit Lifesteal is really important to have because it allows you to spam Malice, which costs a lot of health, and I think it's Lady Geist's best ability. I think not having any Bullet Lifesteal is a mistake, and Leech just gives you that, what you need. It just gives you survivability, damage, and sustain in such a large amount that you just don't need other sources, really. And I find it really hard to pass up Leech, and I find when Leech is in my build, it makes my build way better. I will say, if you don't focus on weapon damage at all, and you're just going full into spirit power, Leech becomes significantly worse. But I think if you go a little bit of a hybrid of the two, then Leech is almost mandatory. Now there's other items that are really good on her that I think as well, like Mystic Reverb, Escalating Exposure, Frenzy, Crippling Headshot, Spiritual Overflow. There's just so many 6k items that are really good on Lady Geist that it's honestly hard to pick things that stand out. It really depends on how your build is shaping up. If you're going more weapon damage heavy, then things like Crippling Headshot will stand out way more to you. If you're going more spirit power heavy, then things like Mystic Reverb and Escalating Exposure will stand out way more to you. And if you're going a hybrid between the two, then Spiritual Overflow is something that is also really nice.